Welcome to the Evangelism Podcast. I'm Daniel King, and I'm excited about telling people about Jesus. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Paul Fraser. Thank you so much for joining me on the Evangelism Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, well, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so been in ministry now 25 years. Went to Bible college right out of high school and got married early. Went right into ministry, pastor in a local church. Worked at a Christian school for a bit as a campus pastor. Ended up working at a regional district office as the district youth director, and eventually kind of not aged out, but then kind of moved on to uh, running our church planting for our district, among other things. And now I work at the PAOC national office as the National Church Multiplication Coordinator, which is the sister organization to Assemblies of God US, and get an opportunity to work with some of the best leaders, pioneering, entrepreneurial, coming from all over the world to help us reach people in Canada through church planting. So it's a great job. Love doing it. Lots of travel. Get to meet some great people. So just really enjoying this season of ministry.
Yeah, the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, the PAOC, is just a great organization. About how many churches are in the POAC right now?
Yeah, so we would have about somewhere around 1100, or maybe 1080 to 1100, somewhere in there, of self-governing churches. Add probably another 150, 130, somewhere in there. We're somewhere around 1200 altogether, with satellite campuses, self-governing churches, and right across Canada. And we have 8 districts. And so yeah, it's we've had a great we just turned 100 years old in 2019, and had tremendous growth. But for the last 20 years or so, just been plateauing, incrementally growing. So within the last 10 years, we've had a really big push on church planting, and just seeing some really fun, great results from that.
And so you're leading the Multiply Network. And I really like what it says on your website, that your goal is that every Canadian would have an access point to the gospel. And so talk to me a little bit about kind of what God is doing in Canada, what opportunities you see, and then what challenges the church in Canada is facing right now.
Yeah, great questions, and thanks for referencing that, because that is our big tagline. If if you don't have a burden for the lost, you shouldn't be planting a church. Like, we're not just looking to have more services for church people. There has to be a real sense of, yeah, like your church, your people, your social media, your everything could be an access point to the gospel for people to find Jesus, to have that life transforming love affect their life. And we're in an interesting, I don't know where you're listening from in the world today, because I know these podcasts, the world just made is so much smaller. But in Canada, we've lived in a post kind of Christian uh, age for, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years. It depends who you ask. And so it's great because, on the one hand, people don't have a lot of history of, like, well, I got hurt by church because I did this and that. But it's like there's a real sense of, like, curiosity. There was a time in Canada, probably just like the US, where 90% of Canadians went to church. Of course, that was the early 1900s, and everyone went to church on Sunday. It was kind of cultural, and everyone did that. And now, right around that 10% or a little less in Canada. So we really see a need for fresh expressions, new ways to reach people far from God, and to work with younger leaders who have a different call maybe than what I had and than what my parents had, and are being creative and getting excited about trying new things and experimenting. And so I'm really grateful that I get to be a part with them, provide maybe the banks of the river, for some of these young leaders that want to do something, like, hey, let's do that, but let's also have some structure. Let's also have some of this. And so the opportunities here are, I actually think people are open to spirituality, There's an openness to prayer. There's an openness to hearing what you believe. And so, it used to be, evangelism was, very different. It was, how I kind of described it in Canada was, invite people to church. The pastor invites them to Jesus. And if we're on the ball, we invite them into our life. And that can still work. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think maybe a more effective model is maybe invite them into your life. You invite them to Jesus, and then church makes so much more sense. Like when I mean church, I mean the Sunday gathering. So I just think there's an opportunity for people every day living on mission, reading the Great Commission as you go about your day, make disciples. And so there's a lot of so there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I would say the obstacles are probably the same most places, that there's a hardness of heart. Scriptures tell us that the God of this world has blinded the eyes of men, and so they just can't see. And so we bump into those things. There's an apathy at times within our church culture, perhaps, that's a bit more consumer, less about cause. And so, I get concerned about that. I get concerned about when people think all I need to do to be a Christian is attend church regularly, give, and volunteer. And then I'm fulfilling, my role. And I just think, no, Jesus is also concerned about some other things, about you living on mission every day, 24/7. He's Lord all the time. So I think we bump into the same obstacles. I mean, we could talk culturally, even from this, even though Canada and the US are right next to each other, there's some significant change, differences in thinking there.
Yeah,
But I would
what do
say
you
that,
see are some of the differences between the United States and Canada as far as church
yeah,
culture and reaching out to people? I'm very interested in this because I've actually
yeah,
been praying a lot for Canada. My wife is Canadian. She grew up in Morinville, small town right outside of the Edmonton
I know
area.
where that is. Yeah,
And uh, so I met her in the middle of Africa. She was a missionary girl sent out from Canada. And so God brought us together. And since I'm married to a Canadian, now our ministry is an official charity in Canada, King Ministries Canada. And so every year we go up to visit her family up in Morinville. And I usually preach at different churches in different parts of Alberta and other parts of Canada. So I've really been praying for Canada. I've been praying for revival to come to Canada. But as an American, it's it's easy to be perceived as being too pushy. I think Americans tend to be more pushy than Canadians, and Canadians they don't like that. And so, what do you see are
yeah,
some of the differences between America and in Canada?
yeah. Like it, we have a big value on individuality. So we would, and I don't know if this is true anymore, but when I grew up, going to high school, it was kind of like Canada was this multicultural, individualistic. You can be whatever you need to be, however you need to be. But in the US, it was, and so we call that, the multiculturalism of Canada. And then a bit of and of course in the US, this has changed significantly since I've been to high school, but just kind of that melting pot where it's like, no, if you move to the US, you're American. But in Canada, you would be like, African Canadian, or you're from Spain, but you're also Canadian. But so there's a sense of individuality. So we get offended easy. So that's why we get, sometimes when people we perceive as pushy, is like, whoa, hey, can't we all just get along here? And it's like, so I find the directness of, like, at least in churches, it's easier to be direct. I find it's easier to have conversations with people in the US. I think it's like, honestly, when I travel, I was down for conferences twice this year already, and just sitting down at tables talking with people, it's just like, wow, like they're just so easy. And because we're individualistic, we feel like we don't want to talk to people about our personal lives or faith, and we don't want to offend. That's like the cardinal sin of being Canadian. And so if you offend, you always say, I'm sorry. We always get Canadians are like, just, they're so apologetic because we're always offended. So I
I'm
think there's
sorry
some
for being
differences
sorry
there.
so much. I'm sorry for being
Yeah,
sorry
like
so
I'm
much.
sorry for being sorry, and I'm sorry that I offended you, and all of those things. And but when it comes to church planting, we're 1/10 the size of the U.S. And so when sometimes the books get written from a U.S. perspective, saying, "Oh, your launch team needs to be this many people, and you should have this many people on Sunday," and this is how fast. And you hear the stories of like, "Yeah, we started in our garage and we grew to 500, in 6 months," and those stories happen because the population density is different there. I think there's a bit more openness maybe to coming to a Sunday gathering where there'd be less in Canada. And we just find like a 500-person church in Canada is like bordering on large. Like if you're 500-person, you're so times 10, that's a 5,000-person church
Yeah.
in the US. And so I think we always feel a little like just we're the little brother for sure in that. And so we kind of resist some of the US strategies for church planting because they just don't jive the same. So I think we grow a little bit more organically in our thinking, and we're less like big box store structure. I think we're a little bit more agile. We're able to explore things a little bit different. Of course, those are huge generalizations, but that would just be some of my takes as I go to church planting conferences and leadership and different things like that as it relates to church world. But and then some of the cultural differences there as well.
Yeah. So, in the Canadian context, what are you doing to help churches to multiply and grow?
Yeah. So obviously sharing the vision of church multiplication, the opportunity for us to reach people far from God. I try to remind a church planter as they're like trying to figure out banking and trying to figure out structures and finances and all these things and teams. And I try to remind them like, hey, picture that first person that gets saved on a Sunday, or someone says from your core team they got like picture that. And so keeping the vision of why we're doing it is really important. When a church planter or somebody, and again, I think church planting is one of the most effective ways in North America to reach people far from God. I think there's a lot of stats that would support that. Even the eyeball test for me as I go around different churches and compare size of church and look at their stats year over year to an existing church, that there are more salvations that happen in a church plant. But keeping the vision in front of them, keeping it like this is why we're doing it. We're not just like one of the things that I think maybe church planting 20 years ago was built more around we're planting a service, not a church. Like, let's just plant a gathering. And then, because that was a really effective way to reach people, and it was. But I think less and less, certainly post COVID, we're seeing like regular attendance to a church now be 2.2 times a month. And we're seeing boomers not come back to church. And Gen Xers specifically are two groups that just they're not coming back. Millennials with young families and Gen Xers, or Gen Z, they seem to be, finding their way back to, houses of worship in churches. But yeah, man, I think just keeping the vision in front of them, like this is why we do it. And this is, and if you went on our website too, I think somewhere else, we try to exist to take the guesswork out of it to help churches because they don't have time to read all the books. They don't have time to do all the training. They don't have time to do all the steps that are needed to help get a new disciple making community going. So we try to come alongside them and support them. We want to come alongside their vision, their idea, but obviously we want to share like, yeah, we need to be like planting churches because we're closing churches, not to at least in our POC tribe, we're slightly outpacing our closures with new starts. And that's just not, we're not going to reach Canada incrementally. It's got to be this multiplication exponential thing. And so sharing the vision of like, you can start a church, you can do it. Maybe it's micro church. Maybe it's a campus. Maybe, it's an organic grow where you look at a town next to you and you start an alpha. And, everybody can kind of do something. Everyone can be an access point to the gospel. And so we just try to share that vision, get them and equip them and train them as best we can.
Now, I really like the fact that you're mentoring and coaching church planners. So, kind of talk me through that process. If you have a young man of God who comes to you and says, "It's really been on my heart to start a church. I really feel a call to be in ministry, to be a pastor." How would you encourage him to plan a church and then walk him through the process? How long does that process take? And what are some of
Yeah.
the things that you're telling him?
Yeah, so we have church planters who kind of jump into our pipeline, either at a district level or at a national level. And one of the things that there was a book some years ago written by, I'm just trying to look for it on my shelf to get the, I think it's called The Honest Guide to Church Planting by Tom Bernardo. And I get them to read that book. And if they still want to plant churches, like after reading that book, then it's like, okay, that's like a good first step. And literally, that's what I've done. I'm like, please read this book because it's honest. Like, hey, the people you start with won't be the people there in 3 years. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. People say they're with you and then won't. And then new people will come with new ideas and try to shift the vision and, all those things. And so if you read that, that's great. But so we try to get them like, try to get them to realistically look at not an ideal world like dream world that this is what I hear all the church planting stories and everything's going to be like this. Like it's actually hard work. It's a grind. Making disciples isn't easy. Reaching people far from God and getting into that culture. So I try to try to figure out, okay, how serious are you about it? Have you read this book? What do you think? So we talk about that. But as we go through the coaching, there's also an assessment that needs to happen. It's not just good enough that you're called. There's a certain skill set that you're going to need for a certain, whatever model of church planting. So we walk them through pre-assessment and then we walk them through a formal assessment. After that, that would then kind of kick in some coaching. It would kick in some training. And, to do most launch model churches, you're looking at about 9 to 12 months because there's fundraising that needs to happen. There's training, team development, finding space, leasing, all those things. So I try to, try to get them thinking like if you want to start in September, you're going to need, really to be hitting it pretty hard in January. Now, some guys start a year out. And I think if you get your team meeting too early, you'll lose a bit of steam when you actually need it in launch season. So there's this like balance of like, yes, I want to get the team on board, but I don't want to start too early because our launch is still 9 months away. So yeah, but it's usually about 9 months in monthly coaching. I'm available. Our district lead teams, our multiply network lead team is available to answer questions. And so what makes our movement a little interesting is it's not standardized. Every district has a different process. So I try to learn all the processes and then just come alongside them. We're working on talking about standardizing some things, but we're literally the multiply network is here to serve them. And so whatever we can do to help them, we do. But yeah, I actually am a certified life coach. And so this is just really up my alley and I love doing it and just really helping them get from where they are today to where they want to be. That's just a real big dream of mine.
Yeah, coaching is so valuable. You can either learn from your mistakes or you can learn from someone else's mistakes. And so a coach can help you avoid some of the big mistakes that might be made. What are some of the mistakes that church planners sometimes make that you can help them to avoid?
Yeah. So I think starting too early with a team, that is definitely one. Um, Leaving fundraising too late is another thing where you don't say, yeah, I'm working on building the team. It's like, have you talked to any donors yet? Have you talked to your district? Have you talked to churches that might, oh no, yeah, I'm going to get to that. And, we try to build into their training, like have one conversation a week, 9 months out. Because sometimes it takes 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 meetings before a donor feels comfortable, like, oh, this is actually going to go. And one of the important things that we try to drill in is like, hey, donor confidence is critically important. So have good reporting, have good all of that. I would say what's another mistake that planters, oh, they try to do too much on their own and they don't rely enough on team. So you want to make sure you have a team, develop your team, spend time with them. Take time to think through your discipleship pathway. That's huge. Like, what is it? And if I walked into your church day one, could your core team tell me the next step? Like, what's the next step in discipleship? Are they aware of your discipleship pathway? Because I ask pastors all the time, hey, do you guys have a discipleship pathway? Yes, we do. Great. Does anyone know it? Like, is it functioning? Is it clear? Does your board know it? Does your team know it? So we don't want to be planting churches that don't have disciple making culture. So I drill down, like, you tell me someone walking off the street who's never heard the name of Jesus before and get them to be a leader in your church. What's the process? And that's the kind of thinking I really, really want to have in our new churches that we start, is that disciple making culture. Because I think we overlook it and think, well, discipleship will just kind of accidentally happen. No, what's the intentional process, steps, training that you need to build this culture in your church? That's critically important. And I think people get excited about having space and thinking that it's going to be theirs forever. And the reality is, you'll move probably several times before you'll find a more permanent space. And you just got to be okay with with flexibility. We try to drill that in. Don't be too rigid. Don't try to get too worked up about how things aren't moving. So I don't know, just off the top of my head, those are some of the things that I think through and try to help planters think through.
What would an ideal discipleship process look like? I think that's a great question. If you have someone coming off the street who doesn't know Jesus, and you want to bring them through their relationship and eventually become a leader in the church, what are some discipleship processes that you've seen that you really think other churches should emulate?
Yeah, so this is probably the most simple one that I've created with our training. It comes from actually Dr. Howard Hendricks years ago. And I can't remember if I was at a conference or I heard it on a tape. Remember when we used to have tapes? You could have a tape player.
That was a long time ago.
That was a long time, like
back when Jesus walked on the earth. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think he captured something that was really, really important. He talked about characteristics of a disciple. So I don't care how this gets done. I don't care where it gets done. I just want to ensure that person walking off the street has these three things that are being built into them, the characteristics of a disciple. Again, from Dr. Howard Hendricks. First one, are you a learner? So you need someone to ensure that this new person is, what are they learning? Second thing, who are they following? So do they have, and again, now today with content being so accessible, you actually have to get into people's lives. Like, who are you listening to? Like, what podcast? Like, but to have someone just walking with them, again, you can't disciple from a distance very well. You've got to there's a proximity piece. So what am I learning? Who am I following? And then there needs to be evaluation and what's being reproduced in my life. And I think we need to spend a little bit more time on that thing, making sure that the people we're discipling are producing the fruit of the Spirit. So we actually go through it with them. How's your love level? Joy, peace, patience, kindness. Because when you're connected to Christ, you bear this. You don't have to work hard. So this is a telltale sign that you are connected to Jesus if this fruit is growing in your life. So you ask questions like, how's your patience level with your kids? Not great. Okay. How do we fix that? Connection to Jesus. Great. How's your self-control? Not great. Okay, great. How do we fix that? Connection to Jesus. And so we can use those characteristics as a way. And again, that can have your small groups, one-on-one. I think Sunday mornings can play a huge part in that, on the teaching and inspiration, that type of thing. And then at some point, they turn from learner, follower, reproducer to teacher, leader, and multiplier. So when you feel like what am I learning? Who am I following? What's being reproduced in my life? Then we ask you to be a teacher. What are you teaching? How are you leading? And what are you multiplying in others? So there's that you start as the student, but at some point the discipleship process should lead you to uh, you know, teacher, leader, and then multiplier. So I say, I don't care how that shows up, but are those characteristics being built into the culture of your church? And if they are, then there's a good chance that a discipleship culture is being developed. But it does take time.
Do you find that you need different strategies for different parts of Canada? Like when you go to Alberta, Vancouver, there's some really big churches, some really amazing churches. Then you go to like Quebec and it's under 2% Christian. I mean, it's really like a mission
Yeah,
field over there.
yeah.
Are you developing different strategies for different parts of Canada?
Yeah, I think we need to. Certainly, you make a great point about Quebec being francophone, I think it's less than 1% evangelical. So when you think about like our Western hemisphere, it's one of the darkest places, like void of evangelical gospel witness. It's Quebec, and there's just a different culture and mindset there. So yeah, I think there has to be a different strategy for our francophone family and province. I think there's a different strategy that's needed for uh, suburban, urban, and rural. So it's not just one cookie cutter. Here's how it works, and all of those mean something different. So an urban center in Saskatchewan, for example, is I think Saskatoon is maybe 400,000 people. That would be urban for Saskatchewan. Okay. What's urban in Toronto is, 11 million people in the GTA area. So there is a huge difference when we talk urban from district to district. Rural, even rural, like in Ontario, they think like a rural town is like 15 or 20,000, but rural in Alberta or Manitoba or Saskatchewan might be 150 people. So you're right. We have to contextualize this for each province, and then as you break it down for each part of the province, like Northwest Territories, for example, like up there, like Canada's got this massive landmass, and but I think there's like don't quote me on it, maybe 60,000 people in all of Northwest Territories. Like it's just really spread out in time. So you need a different church planting strategy and mission strategy for that too. So the diversity, the different kind of Canada, and Maritimers are different than West Coast. And I mean, it would be the same in the US, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the East Coast is very different than Oklahoma, where I live. It's very much
Right.
more of a mission field, and it takes a whole
Yeah.
different uh, thick skin to go and witness to all the heathens that live over there that maybe don't have a tradition of knowing God. I mean, here in Oklahoma, even people that don't go to church, they grew up in church at least, so they know something
Right.
about God.
There's a Christian memory. There's a
Yeah.
Christian memory, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Another
Yeah.
unique opportunity I think you have in Canada is there are so many people coming to Canada from many different parts of the world,
Yes.
where Canada
Yes.
for many years has sent missionaries out all over the world, but now God is really bringing the mission field to you. And especially in Edmonton, I mean, you've got people of every different culture and language and different
Yeah.
foods
Yeah.
that you can eat. And so that's a unique
Yeah.
opportunity for the church to reach out cross culturally and cross language
Yeah.
groups. And God is bringing
And
you
I
people that need Jesus.
and people who know Jesus. That's the other thing. Like some of our best church planters that we've had in the last 5 years moved here in the last 5 years. Like they planted multiple churches, or so that Luke 10:2, Lord, send workers into your harvest fields. And we are reaping the efforts, the missional heart of missionaries going overseas to, you name the country. And God has used, those decades of faithful ministry to raise up people who have now come back to Canada, to help us reach people far from God. So not only are there, like, I think 300 or 400,000 people are immigrating to Canada from around the world every single year. So that is a huge opportunity, but many of them are coming already faith-filled believers, spirit-empowered believers, and come here and go, how do we help you reach Canada? We're going to help you reach those from Afghanistan who are being brought here. We're going to help you reach those from Pakistan and from India and from Africa, and Europe, and you just go through the list, and you just are so thankful that God cares enough about Canada that he's raising up people from all over the world to come here. We're so honored. And I'll be honest with you, our biggest growing edge of church planting is our cultural language group pastors. And they bring this apostolic gifting and heart that is such a blessing to us. If we had more time, I could tell you stories of what God has done through them and how they're impacting their country still through online ministry. So they're here in Canada planting churches, seeing fruitful ministry, and are still leading at home, seeing great things, getting up in the middle of the night to preach at their church Sunday morning. Amazing. Like, it's just these wonderful leaders, men and women, are gifts to us, and we thank God for them.
That's awesome. Well, Brother Paul, thank you so much for being a guest on the Evangelism Podcast. Let's finish up today by praying for the nation of Canada. If you're listening, you want to know more about the PAOC and the Multiply Network, you can go to www.paocmultiply.com and find out more information. But let's just finish up by praying for God to pour out his Spirit upon the nation of Canada. And from sea to shining sea, I see God pouring out his Spirit upon all of Canada.
Come on.
Go ahead. And
so you want me to pray?
Yeah, go for it.
So God, thank you for this podcast. Thank you for Pastor Daniel, who just is willing to find and connect and bring great voices together to hopefully share and inspire, teach, and learn about what you are doing today and what you want to do in the future. And so I thank you for this podcast. Bless it, and bless him as he continues to travel all over and just preach your word and see so many lives transformed by the moving of your Spirit. But we do think of Canada today from, as was mentioned, sea to sea to sea. We have 3 of them that are surrounding Canada. And I pray, God, for a heart that would turn back to you. There are wells of strong Christian foundation. There's a history that, God, this was a Christian nation at one point. And so wherever people are, whatever they're listening, however they're listening to this right now, and whenever they're listening to it, that there would be an agreement for you to do something special in Canada. God, I believe that if Canada wins, the world is going to win. A Canada that is sending, a Canada that has got kingdom culture is going to help impact the world. And God, I thank you for what you've done in the last 100 years in POC, but I pray our former years, God, that our future years would be better than our former years. And we had great years, but we're believing that there's even better days ahead. So God, we together in agreement pray for all those in Canada, over 30 million people who don't know you as Lord and Savior. We pray, God, that even in this next decade, we would see a mighty move of your Spirit sweep across this nation. And we thank you for Canada, and we thank you that it's got a great place in the world to be an impact for you. And we ask all this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you for being on the Evangelism Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Daniel King is on a mission to save 1 million souls a year, but he can't do it alone. Would you consider sowing a financial seed today? To give, please visit www.kingministries.com.